The morning air tasted like rain and asphalt when Rex's growl changed everything. Officer Marcus Chen felt the vibration through the leash before he heard the sound. A low, rumbling warning that started deep in his partner's chest and rolled forward like distant thunder. Rex's entire body went rigid, every muscle locked, ears pinned flat against his skull. Marcus had worked with the German Shepherd for 4 years, through drug busts and building searches and crowd control, and he had never seen Rex look at a child like this. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She walked alone down the sidewalk toward Riverside Elementary, her sneakers scuffed and her backpack hanging heavy on thin shoulders. Dark hair pulled into a ponytail that hadn't been brushed that morning. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone much older. Someone who carried weight that had nothing to do with textbooks. And she showed absolutely no fear. Marcus tightened his grip on the leash as Rex's lips curled back, exposing teeth that had stopped runners and subdued suspects without hesitation. But this girl just stopped walking and looked directly at the dog with eyes that seemed too tired for her age. "Easy, Rex. Easy, boy." Marcus kept his voice low and steady, the tone he used when his partner was scenting something dangerous. But there was nothing dangerous here. Just a kid on her way to school. Just another Wednesday morning outside the station. Rex didn't ease. He shifted his weight forward, every line of his body screaming alert, and the girl did something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She stepped closer. Not away. Closer. And she leaned down just slightly, her lips barely moving, and whispered something that Marcus couldn't hear over the morning traffic and the blood pounding in his own ears. Whatever she said, Rex heard it. The dog's growl cut off like someone had flipped a switch. His ears came forward. His body stayed tense, coiled, but the aggression drained away into something else. Something Marcus couldn't name. The girl straightened, adjusted the straps of her backpack with small, deliberate movements, and continued walking toward the school without looking back. Marcus watched her go, watched the way her shoulders curved forward under that bag, watched her disappear around the corner, and felt Rex trembling beside him. Not with aggression, with something that looked almost like frustration. What was that about, partner? Marcus crouched down and ran his hand along Rex's back, checking for tension, for injury, for anything that might explain the reaction. Rex whined, a high, urgent sound that didn't match anything in his training vocabulary. The dog turned his head to watch the corner where the girl had vanished, then looked back at Marcus with an intensity that felt almost like accusation. Like Marcus had missed something crucial, like he'd failed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. It happened again on Thursday. Same time, 7:32 in the morning, according to the timestamp on the security feed Marcus pulled later. Rex spotted her from 30 yards away and went rigid before Marcus even registered the small figure approaching. Same growl, same locked muscles, same careful approach from the girl who should have been running in the opposite direction. Same whispered words that Rex alone could hear. And this time Marcus noticed something he'd missed before. The way the girl paused before she whispered, the way her eyes searched Rex's face like she was asking a question, like she expected an answer. Friday brought rain and an earlier arrival, 7:24 by the clock on the station wall. Marcus had positioned himself outside deliberately, Rex at his side, both of them waiting. The girl came from the same direction, but her backpack looked heavier, pulling her shoulders down at a sharper angle. Her sneakers splashed through puddles she didn't seem to notice. When Rex started that low growl, Marcus watched the girl's face instead of his partner's. She didn't flinch, didn't slow her pace, just walked right up to the edge of Rex's range and stopped, rain dripping from her hair, her small hands wrapped around the backpack straps like lifelines. This time Marcus heard a single word of what she whispered. "Please." Just that. soft and desperate and entirely wrong coming from someone so young. Then she was gone again, and Rex was pulling at the leash with a force that had nothing to do with pursuit and everything to do with need. Marcus started arriving at the station 40 minutes early, Monday through Friday, always outside, always with Rex. And the girl, Emma, he learned her name from the crossing guard, who knew every kid on the route. Emma came earlier too. By the following Wednesday, she was passing the station at 7:05, when the morning shift was still filing in and the streetlights were just starting to fade against the dawn. Her backpack had changed. It used to be purple with cartoon characters. Now it was a plain black pack that looked too big for her frame, and the way she carried it. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Rex's reaction had evolved from aggression into something Marcus could only describe as frantic alerting. The dog would sit when Emma appeared, rigid and focused, every sense locked on the child, and the trembling that ran through his body felt like barely contained urgency. Marcus pulled security footage from 3 weeks back, watched Emma pass the station every morning on her way to school, counted the days, measured the timestamps, and saw what his instincts had been whispering all along. The pattern, the escalation. 3 weeks ago, she'd walked by at 7:45, casual and unhurried, her old purple backpack swinging light at her side. 2 weeks ago, 7:38, and the backpack had changed. 10 days ago, 7:26, and her shoulders had started to curve. Now she was arriving before most of the city was awake, carrying weight that bent her small frame forward with every step, and whispering secrets to a police dog who couldn't tell Marcus what he so desperately sensed. On Thursday of that second week, Rex broke protocol. Emma was early again, 6:58 according to Marcus's watch. She approached with that same exhausted determination, and when she leaned down to whisper her daily message, Rex lunged, not at her, at the backpack. Marcus had the leash wrapped twice around his wrist, and it still nearly pulled him off balance. Rex's teeth didn't connect with the girl. They closed on the black fabric of the pack with a grip Marcus recognized from evident seizures and narcotic alerts. Emma stumbled backward, eyes wide, finally showing the fear that should have been there from the beginning. Marcus pulled Rex back with both hands, muscle straining against muscle, his voice sharp with command and confusion and something close to panic. "Rex, out now!" The dog released but didn't retreat. He stayed locked on that backpack, every fiber of his being screaming, "Alert, alert, alert!" And Marcus saw Emma's hands shaking as she steadied herself. Saw the way she clutched the pack to her chest like it contained something more precious than homework or lunch money. Saw the tears that filled her eyes but didn't fall. And he understood, in that crystallized moment with his heart hammering and Rex whining that urgent, desperate sound, that his partner had been trying to tell him something from the very first morning. Something that couldn't wait any longer. Something hidden in a child's backpack that a trained police dog recognized as critical. And something a 7-year-old girl was willing to face down a snarling canine to protect. Marcus held Rex's leash with hands that had started to shake. And he watched Emma walk away again, faster this time, her small figure disappearing into the gray morning, while his partner trembled beside him and every instinct Marcus had ever trusted told him he'd just let something vital slip through his fingers. Marcus didn't go inside the station that morning. He stood in the spot where Emma had stumbled backward, Rex still quivering beside him, and pulled out his phone with fingers that felt clumsy and cold. The security footage app loaded slowly, too slowly, and he scrolled back through the saved clips from the past 3 weeks, frame by frame, morning by morning, watching a pattern he'd sensed but never fully analyzed until Rex had forced his hand. The data painted a picture that made his chest tighten. Emma's arrival times formed a descending line when he plotted them mentally. 7:45, becoming 7:30, becoming 7:15, becoming 6:58. each day a few minutes earlier. Each day carrying her a little deeper into the pre-dawn darkness. But it was the backpack that told the real story. Marcus zoomed in on the clearest frames and felt something cold settle in his stomach. 3 weeks ago, the purple pack with fading cartoon characters had hung loose at her sides, swaying with her steps. 2 weeks ago, the black pack had appeared, larger, heavier, pulling at her shoulders with visible weight. Last week, the straps had started cutting into her jacket, leaving creases in the fabric. This morning, her entire posture had changed. Spine curved, steps shorter, the kind of physical adaptation that came from carrying a burden too heavy for too long. Rex pressed against Marcus's leg, still watching the corner where Emma had disappeared. The dog's breathing hadn't steadied. If anything, the urgency in his body language had intensified after the lunge. Like coming that close to the source had confirmed something terrible instead of resolving it. Marcus crouched down and met his partner's eyes, brown and intelligent and deeply frustrated. "I know, boy. I know you're trying to tell me something." Rex's tail gave a single sharp wag. Not happiness, but acknowledgement. Agreement. Yes. Finally, now do something about it. Marcus made 3 calls before his shift officially started. The first was to Riverside Elementary, where a tired-sounding secretary transferred him to Emma's second-grade teacher after he identified himself and explained it wasn't an emergency. Not yet, anyway, just a welfare check. Mrs. Patterson picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious the way voices got when police called about their students. "Emma's been here every day," she said after Marcus explained he'd noticed the girl walking alone each morning. "Always on time, never misses." But then she paused, and Marcus heard the shift in her tone that meant she'd been noticing things too. She's changed in the last few weeks, Officer Chen. She used to participate. Raise her hand. Now she just sits there looking exhausted. I've asked her if everything's okay at home, and she always says yes, but..." Another pause. "Her homework's been perfect. Every single assignment. Like she's desperate not to give anyone a reason to question anything." Marcus thanked her and ended the call with a promise to follow up. The second call went to the district's family services liaison, a woman named Torres, who Marcus had worked with on truancy cases before. She pulled Emma's file while he waited, and when she came back on the line, her voice had gone carefully neutral. "Family of 3. Mother works 2 jobs, I can confirm, probably a 3rd off the books. Older brother, 15, not enrolled in school this semester due to medical issues. No CPS reports, no red flags, father's not in the picture." She hesitated. "What's this about, Marcus?" He told her about Rex's reaction, about the backpack, about the pattern of earlier arrivals and increasing weight. Torres was quiet for a long moment. "Medical issues," she said finally. "That's all the file says. But if there's something going on with medication or treatment, if the family's struggling with that..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The 3rd call was to his sergeant, requesting a late start and permission to follow up on a potential juvenile welfare concern. Approved. Marcus clipped Rex's leash to his belt and headed for his unmarked cruiser, the dog jumping into the passenger seat with practiced ease. They had 3 hours before Emma would be released from school. 3 hours to understand what a 7-year-old girl was hiding in a backpack that made a trained K9 lose his professional composure. Marcus parked 2 blocks from Riverside Elementary at 2:40 in the afternoon, Rex alert in the seat beside him. The school doors opened at 3, and kids poured out in the chaotic wave of released energy that always made Marcus think of uncorked bottles. He spotted Emma almost immediately, not because she stood out, but because she deliberately didn't. She walked alone, staying to the edges of the crowd, her black backpack settled on her shoulders like a familiar weight. She didn't head toward the station. Instead, she turned left, where she should have turned right, moving away from the direct route home that would take her past Marcus's usual post. Marcus waited 30 seconds, then followed at a distance, Rex's leash loose in his hand. The dog had gone still the moment Emma appeared, his focus absolute. They tracked her through 2 residential blocks, then into a commercial stretch where the storefronts grew shabbier and the sidewalks developed cracks that nobody bothered to fix. Emma moved with purpose, no hesitation, taking a route she'd clearly walked before. She cut through an alley behind a closed laundromat, and Marcus held back at the corner, watching. A teenage boy waited near a dumpster, hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders hunched against a cold wind that wasn't blowing. He was tall and too thin, with dark hair that matched Emma's and a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't so hollow. When Emma approached, he looked around with the careful paranoia of someone used to being watched, then crouched down to her level. Marcus couldn't hear what they said, couldn't see what the boy pulled from his jacket pocket and pressed into Emma's small hands. But he saw the way Emma's fingers closed around it immediately, protective and practiced. Saw the way she tucked whatever it was into her backpack with movements that spoke of routine. Saw the boy touch her shoulder with a gentleness that looked like gratitude and guilt combined. The exchange took less than 20 seconds. Emma turned and retraced her steps through the alley, and Marcus pulled Rex back around the corner before she could spot them. His heart was hammering again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the sick understanding that came from watching pieces fall into place in a pattern he'd seen before, but never from this angle. The boy had to be the brother Torres mentioned. The medical issues. The weight in Emma's backpack that grew heavier each day. Rex's frantic alerting that wasn't about danger or drugs or any of the things his training had taught him to detect. Rex had been trying to tell Marcus that someone needed help, that someone was suffering, that the little girl who walked past the station every morning with her shoulders bending under weight no child should carry was smuggling something desperate enough to risk everything for, and that time was running out. Marcus waited until Emma had rounded the next corner before he moved, following at a greater distance now, Rex pulling slightly at the leash with that same urgent energy. The girl headed toward a cluster of apartment buildings where paint peeled from the siding and windows were patched with cardboard and tape. She climbed stairs to a third-floor unit and disappeared inside. Marcus stood across the street, watching the darkened windows, his radio silent on his belt, and his mind racing through procedure and protocol and every regulation that was about to get bent. Because tomorrow morning, when Emma walked past the station with her backpack full of secrets, he was going to stop her. Gently, carefully, with Rex at his side and every ounce of patience he'd ever learned. And he was finally going to ask the question his partner had been screaming at him to ask for 3 weeks. What are you carrying, Emma? What's in the backpack? And what are you so desperate to protect that you'll face down a police dog every single morning just to keep it hidden? The morning came too fast and too slow all at once. Marcus arrived at the station at 6:15, earlier than Emma had ever appeared, Rex tense and focused beside him as they took their position on the sidewalk. The sky was still caught between night and dawn, streetlights throwing long shadows across pavement that gleamed with overnight rain. Marcus had barely slept, had spent hours reviewing what he knew and what he suspected, and the thin line between intervention and overreach. Had called Torres again at midnight to discuss options and protocols, and the reality that sometimes you had to act on instinct before you had all the facts locked down. She'd promised to have resources ready, had given him the direct number for a medical charity that specialized in cases exactly like the one Marcus suspected was unfolding, had reminded him gently that scared kids rarely told the truth the first time you asked. Rex shifted his weight at 6:42, ears snapping forward. Marcus felt it through the leash before he saw her. That electric current of alertness that meant his partner had locked onto something critical. Emma appeared from the pre-dawn shadows, her small figure moving with the same exhausted determination Marcus had watched for 3 weeks. The black backpack rode heavy on her shoulders, pulling her spine into that familiar curve. She was earlier than yesterday, earlier than she'd ever been. And when she spotted Marcus and Rex waiting directly in her path instead of standing to the side, she stopped walking. For 5 full seconds, they faced each other across 20 feet of empty sidewalk. Marcus kept his hands relaxed, his posture open, Rex sitting calmly at his side despite the trembling that ran through the dog's entire frame. Emma's face was unreadable in the dim light. Exhaustion and fear and something harder. Something that looked like resignation. Like she'd known this moment was coming and had simply been counting down the days until it arrived. "Good morning, Emma." Marcus kept his voice gentle, the tone he'd use with any frightened kid. "I'm Officer Chen, this is Rex. We've seen you walk past here a lot of mornings." Emma's hands tightened on her backpack straps. Didn't speak. Didn't move. Marcus took one careful step forward. Just one. And Rex moved with him in perfect sync. "Rex has been really interested in you. In your backpack, actually. He's trained to notice things. Things that might mean someone needs help." Still nothing. But Marcus saw the way her lower lip trembled just slightly. Saw the way her eyes went bright with tears that hadn't fallen yet. "Emma, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I promise you that. But I need to know what you're carrying. Because Rex thinks it's important. And I trust Rex more than I trust just about anything." The silence stretched so long Marcus thought she might just turn and run. Thought he might have to make the call he desperately didn't want to make. The one that brought family services and official reports, and all the machinery that scared kids even more than direct questions. But then Emma's shoulders started shaking. Small, violent tremors that moved through her whole body. And the tears finally came, silent and streaming and full of the kind of despair that had no business on a 7-year-old's face. I can't stop." Her voice came out broken and small. "He needs them. He needs them every day, and Mom can't. She can't afford." The words dissolved into sobs that made Marcus's chest ache. He moved closer, slowly, Rex staying perfectly at his side. When he was 3 feet away, he crouched down to Emma's level, making himself smaller, less threatening. "What does he need, Emma? Your brother? What are you carrying for him?" Emma's hands moved to the backpack's front zipper, fingers fumbling with the pull tab. "If I stop, if I don't bring them, he could die. That's what the doctor said before we lost the insurance. He could die without them." She pulled the zipper open and Marcus saw inside. Insulin pens. Glucose monitors. Test strips still in pharmacy packaging. Alcohol wipes. Lancets. Supplies that should have required prescriptions and insurance approval, and none of the things a family living in a 3rd-floor apartment with peeling paint could afford. The backpack was full of them. Dozens of individual items packed carefully between rolled clothing that served as padding. Marcus's breath left his lungs in a rush that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. "Emma, where are you getting these?" He already knew. Had figured it out during the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn. But he needed to hear her say it. Needed the confirmation before he could move forward with the help that Torres had promised to arrange. Emma wiped her face with shaking hands. "The nurse's office at school. Mrs. Rivera keeps supplies for the diabetic kids. The ones whose parents signed the forms. I started taking one thing at a time 3 weeks ago. Just one. Then I'd meet Danny after school and give it to him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He didn't know at first. Didn't know where I was getting them. But then he figured it out and he told me to stop. But I couldn't. I couldn't let him die. Marcus felt Rex press against his leg, the dog's solid warmth anchoring him as pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The teenage boy in the alley. Danny, 15 years old and trying to manage a life-threatening condition without insurance or resources, while his mother worked herself to exhaustion and his little sister risked everything to keep him alive. Rex hadn't been alerting to drugs or weapons or any traditional threat. He'd been alerting to medical supplies, to the chemical signatures of insulin and glucose test strips, and all the components his training had taught him to recognize in a completely different context. He'd been trying to tell Marcus that someone was sick, that someone was in crisis, that the child walking past the station every morning was carrying the weight of someone else's survival on shoulders too small to bear it. Emma, listen to me very carefully. Marcus kept his voice steady, despite the anger rising in his chest. Not at the girl, never at the girl, but at every system that had failed so completely that stealing had become a child's only option. You are not in trouble. Not with me, not with anyone. What you did, taking those supplies, that's going to be okay. I promise you it's going to be okay. Emma's eyes went wide, disbelieving. But I stole. Mrs. Rivera's going to notice soon. She's going to count them, and… Marcus shook his head gently. I'm going to make some calls right now. To people who help families exactly like yours. People who can get your brother what he needs, legally, safely, without anyone having to steal or go without, or carry weight they shouldn't have to carry. He pulled out his phone and Torres answered on the first ring. Already waiting, already prepared. Marcus gave her the address Emma had disappeared into yesterday, explained what he'd found, listened to her calm professional voice outline the steps that would happen next. Emergency medical assistance. Insurance navigation. A non-profit partnership that provided free diabetic supplies to uninsured families. Social workers who would coordinate with Emma's mother without judgment or condemnation. It would take hours, not days. Torres was already mobilizing resources before Marcus ended the call. When he looked back at Emma, she had dropped to her knees on the wet sidewalk, her small body folded forward over that backpack full of stolen hope. Rex moved before Marcus could react, stepped forward carefully and pressed his nose against Emma's shoulder, that same gentle alertness Marcus had seen in hospital visits and crisis calls. The dog's training had never covered this specific scenario, but his instincts understood what the little girl needed, understood what he'd been trying to communicate for 3 solid weeks. Not danger, need, not threat, desperation. Emma's hand came up slowly and touched Rex's head, the first time she'd ever voluntarily reached for the dog who'd growled at her every morning. Her fingers buried in his dark fur, and she whispered something Marcus couldn't hear. Something that made Rex's tail move in a slow, deliberate wag that had nothing to do with play and everything to do with recognition, with understanding, with the wordless communication that happened between protectors and the protected when fear finally gave way to trust. Marcus spent the next 6 hours inside a system that moved faster than he'd ever seen it move before. Torres arrived at the station 90 minutes after his call, a slim woman in her 40s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen every flavor of family crisis without losing their warmth. She brought a representative from MediShare, the nonprofit that specialized in bridging insurance gaps for chronic conditions, and together they descended on the address Marcus had written down, with the kind of focused efficiency that came from knowing exactly how close to the edge this family was teetering. Emma's mother came home from her overnight shift at the packaging plant to find her living room full of strangers who weren't there to take anything away. Marcus watched from the doorway as Torres explained the situation with a gentleness that acknowledged the mother's exhaustion and pride in equal measure. Watched the woman's face cycle through confusion and fear, and finally break open into something that looked like the first deep breath she'd taken in months. The MediShare representative had already contacted 3 pharmacies and located a medical supply program that would cover Danny's insulin and testing supplies indefinitely. No insurance required, no means testing beyond a single income verification form that could be completed by the end of the week. Danny himself sat on the couch with his hands clenched between his knees, looking at Marcus with eyes that carried guilt and gratitude in measures too heavy for 15. "I told her to stop," he said quietly, his voice rough with the exhaustion that came from rationing insulin and testing blood sugar less frequently than protocol demanded because supplies had to be stretched beyond their limits. "I told Emma I'd be okay, but she wouldn't listen." His mother made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and put her arm around her son's thin shoulders. "Nobody's gonna have to make choices like that anymore," Torres said firmly. And Marcus saw her hand the mother a folder thick with resource information and contact numbers, and appointment confirmations that had already been scheduled at a clinic that charged on a sliding scale. Marcus drove Emma to school himself that morning, 3 hours late, but with a note from Torres that would excuse everything. Rex rode in the back seat, his usual position reversed so he could keep the little girl company. Marcus watched in the rearview mirror as Emma sat with one hand resting on Rex's head, her fingers moving slowly through his fur, her face still streaked with drying tears but somehow lighter than it had been in all the weeks he'd observed her. "Rex knew," she said softly, her voice carrying forward to Marcus in the quiet car. "He knew something was wrong. That's why he always looked at me like that." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Rex is very good at knowing when people need help, even when they're trying really hard to hide it." The school handled the situation with the kind of discretion Torres had promised to arrange. The supplies Emma had taken would be written off as inventory discrepancy, a generous fiction that meant no charges, no reports, no permanent mark on a 7-year-old's record that might follow her for years. Mrs. Rivera, the school nurse, met them at the entrance with eyes that looked suspiciously red and gave Emma a hug that lasted longer than professional protocol usually permitted. "You should have told me," she whispered against Emma's hair. "We could have helped. We would have helped." Emma just nodded against the woman's shoulder, too exhausted for words. Marcus returned to the station as his shift was ending, Rex trotting beside him with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there for 3 weeks. His sergeant met him at the door with raised eyebrows and a tablet displaying the incident report Marcus had filed from his phone during the waiting hours. "This is going to make a hell of a story at the next K9 conference," the sergeant said, but his voice carried approval rather than criticism. "Your dog alerting to medical need instead of contraband. I don't even know what to call that." Marcus looked down at Rex, who sat at attention with his tongue lolling slightly and his tail sweeping the floor in slow, satisfied arcs. "I call it a good partner," Marcus said simply. The following Monday, Emma walked past the station at 7:45, her original time, before desperation had driven her into pre-dawn darkness. Her backpack was purple again, the old one with fading cartoon characters, and it swung light at her sides with a bounce that matched her steps. She saw Marcus and Rex standing in their usual spot, and her face split into a smile that looked like sunrise after a long night. She didn't just walk past. She stopped. Deliberately. Stood directly in front of Rex with her hands on her hips and her chin lifted. "Good morning, Officer Chen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from having survived something terrible and come out the other side. "Good morning, Rex." Rex's tail wagged. A real wag this time, full and happy and free of the desperate urgency that had driven him for weeks. Emma crouched down and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck in a hug that Rex accepted with patient dignity. "Thank you," she whispered against his fur. "Thank you for not giving up." Marcus felt something in his chest crack open, the pressure of 3 weeks of mounting tension finally releasing into something clean and bright. "He never would have," Marcus said quietly. "That's not how Rex works. Once he knows someone needs help, he doesn't quit." Emma stood and adjusted her backpack straps, a gesture that looked habitual but carried none of the weight Marcus had watched her struggle under. "Danny's doing better," she said. And the simple pride in her voice made Marcus smile despite the early hour and the cold wind. He went to the clinic on Friday, and they said his blood sugar's stabilizing now that he has enough insulin. And Mom met with someone about a program that might help her go to school at night so she can get a better job during the day. She paused, suddenly looking younger than her 7 years. "Is it okay if I stop and say hi to Rex every morning? I promise I won't be late to school." Marcus felt Rex press against his leg, the dog's solid presence grounding him in the moment. "Emma, you can stop and say hi whenever you want. Rex would like that. So would I." She grinned and waved, then continued down the sidewalk toward Riverside Elementary, with steps that looked like they belonged to a child again instead of someone carrying burdens too heavy to name. Marcus watched her go, watched her join a group of other kids at the corner, and heard her laugh drift back on the morning air, a sound that had probably been absent from her life for longer than 3 weeks. Rex sat at Marcus's side and looked up at him with brown eyes that held intelligence and satisfaction, and something that looked almost like pride. Marcus crouched down and scratched behind his partner's ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You did good, boy," he said softly. "Better than good. You saved that family. You know that, right? You saw what nobody else could see. You knew what nobody else understood. And you didn't let it go until I finally listened." Rex's tail swept across the pavement in slow, deliberate arcs. Around them, the city woke up in increments, engines starting, doors closing, voices rising in the familiar rhythms of Monday morning routines. Inside the station, radios crackled with calls and officers gathered for briefing, and the machinery of protection and service moved forward like it did every day. But out here, on a patch of sidewalk where a little girl had whispered desperate secrets to a dog who understood what humans had missed, out here, something had shifted. Something had been made right through instinct and trust, and the kind of partnership that went deeper than training or protocol. Marcus stood, and Rex stood with him, both of them facing the direction Emma had gone. The morning stretched ahead, full of calls and reports, and all the ordinary chaos of a patrol shift. But Marcus knew he'd remember this. The weight lifting from a child's shoulders, the smile that reached her eyes, the way Rex had refused to give up until the humans finally understood. The morning routine would continue, day after day, with Emma waving as she passed and Rex's tail wagging in recognition. And every time Marcus saw that light backpack swinging at her sides and heard her laughter mixing with the morning sounds, he'd know exactly what his partner had been trying to tell him all along. That sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't what a K9 could detect in a backpack. Sometimes the most dangerous thing was what happened when nobody was paying attention to the weight a child carried. And sometimes a good dog saw what everyone else missed and refused to stay silent until someone finally listened.